April 1559, the bells of Europe rang out with joy. After decades of ruinous wars that had bled France and Spain alike, envoys gathered at Cateau Cambrésis to seal what many believed to be a final peace. Streets filled with celebrants, court poets composed verses of triumph, and diplomats congratulated themselves on having tamed a century of violence with the stroke of a quill. On paper, the treaty offered stability and end to sieges that had blackened fields from Flanders to Italy, and the promise that two Catholic giants might finally coexist without tearing Christendom further apart. Yet behind the polished words and ornate signatures, the ink that bound peace was mixed with something far more fragile, the life of a 13-year-old girl. Her name was Isabel de Valois, daughter of Henri II of France and Catherine de' Medici. Born into silken ceremony, she had known little beyond the manicured gardens of the Louvre and the protective cocoon of a royal nursery. She still held her porcelain dolls with shy affection, still flushed red at the teasing mention of betrothal, still lived in the world of songs and games. To her, the conflicts that had drained Europe were distant thunder rumours overheard in the whispers of courtiers, not chains around her own life. But to her father's counsel, Isabel was not a child. She was a clause waiting to be enacted, a coin of living flesh in a bargain that demanded collateral. The diplomats praised the accord as a triumph of prudence. Chroniclers described the feasts, the glittering halls, the clash of goblets raised to peace. Yet none recorded the way Isabel lowered her eyes when told her destiny was sealed. For her there was no feast, no triumph. The treaty dictated not just borders and fortresses, but her own body pledged to Philip II of Spain, a king twice her age, notorious for his severity, and consumed by a devotion to faith and power that left no room for warmth. In that moment, Isabel ceased to belong to herself. She became the embodiment of compromise, her name inked into parchment beside the fate of towns and provinces. The French court wrapped the decision in the language of honour and glory. Priests declared it God's will. Courtiers spoke of her as the bridge to a new age of stability. But beneath those words lay a more brutal truth. A girl's innocence was being traded for a respite from war. What the soldiers had failed to win on the battlefield was now extracted from the fragile hands of a child. Imagine the scene in a great hall lit by dripping wax. The treaty is read aloud, each clause a performance of order. Courtiers applaud at the mention of the alliances. Ambassadors beam as the promise of Isabel's marriage is proclaimed. To the men in attendance, she is not there at all. She is an abstraction, a promise, a symbol. But Isabel is there, silent, aware enough to feel the stone floor pressing cold beneath her slippers, aware enough to sense that her future has been taken from her. History will later call it a peace treaty. For her, it was a sentence. Treaties are remembered for maps, redrawn for kings who signed them for the balance of power they temporarily achieved. Yet every treaty also has its hidden cost, borne not by those who write it, but by those offered up as tokens. In Cateau Cambrésis, the cost was the youth of Isabel de Valois. Her life from that day forward would be lived not as a child of France, but as the collateral of two crowns. The court rejoiced that peace had been purchased. Isabel alone understood what had been sold. Before we continue, leave a like and subscribe, only if it truly feels natural. And now softly tell me, where are you listening from? In the glittering chambers of the Louvre, the language of sacrifice was wrapped in ribbons of triumph. Isabel's father, Henri II, listened as his ministers recited the advantages of the match. They spoke of France's weakened armies of treasure, drained by campaigns in Italy, of the Habsburg encirclement that only a union with Spain could loosen. The peace was fragile. To anchor it, they insisted the king's daughter must be given. Not as a child, though that is what she was, but as a key. A lock could not turn without her, they reminded him. And the door that led to stability for France required Isabel's body to serve as its hinge. At first, there was hesitation, if only the hesitation of a father who still saw his daughter as a girl with bright cheeks and soft laughter. But court politics has a way of swallowing tenderness. Around Henri gathered voices that dressed cruelty in noble terms. It is duty, sire, it is the greatness of France. The princess herself will understand. To oppose them was to appear weak, to resist was to betray the logic of dynasty. Henri's doubt lasted only an instant before being drowned beneath the tide of state necessity. For Isabel, the transformation was swift and merciless. One morning her dolls vanished from her chambers, removed by attendants who murmured that such things were no longer fitting for a future queen. In their place appeared rosaries, heavy books of devotion, and tutors who instructed her not in games but in silence, posture and obedience. She was taught to lower her gaze, to smile with modesty, to speak phrases rehearsed until they were stripped of any personal meaning. The princess was no longer being raised as daughter of France. She was being refashioned as a vessel for Spain. The court insisted on calling it honour. The poets described her as the bright lily of Valois, destined to perfume two kingdoms. Preachers declared that she was chosen by Providence itself to reconcile two crowns. Each phrase exalted her, yet each phrase erased her, for in those same salons where her fate was celebrated, Isabel herself was absent. She was not consulted, her voice was never heard. She was instead a cipher upon which men projected their own visions of power. Her mother, Catherine de' Medici, tried to guide her through the transition with a mixture of steel and resignation. Catherine had herself been bartered into France as a Medici bride years before, and she understood better than most that the body of a princess was always provisional, always awaiting the next transaction. Perhaps Catherine whispered advice in private, how to endure, how to hide feelings beneath ceremony, how to survive in a court where compassion was weakness. But whatever sympathy a mother might offer was drowned by the machinery of state that rolled on inexorably. Each evening Isabel was dressed in heavier garments embroidered with emblems that spoke more to politics than to youth. The silks pressed on her shoulders, the jewels weighed down her neck until her very body carried the weight of nations. She walked through corridors once filled with childish laughter, now echoing with the rustle of ceremonial gowns. Every gesture became rehearsal for the role she had not chosen. The irony was sharp, the peace of Europe was being proclaimed, yet inside the walls of the Louvre, a war was being fought against Isabel's childhood. And it was a war she could not win. The strategy was methodical: erase the toys, suppress the spontaneity, train the body discipline, the voice. By the time she was led towards Spain, there would be no girl left to resist, only a queen, constructed for the purpose of obedience. France congratulated itself for producing a living symbol. But in truth it had dismantled a daughter and rebuilt her as a key. And keys are not asked what doors they wish to open. They are turned by others into locks they did not choose. The day chosen for the examination arrived without ceremony for Isabel herself. No one explained to her what it meant, only that she must be ready, that her hair must be combed smooth, her garments heavy with embroidery. She followed her attendants through corridors where the stone walls seemed to close in tighter with every step, until at last they reached a chamber prepared not for comfort, but for scrutiny. The room was hung with dark tapestries that failed to soften its chill. At the centre stood a table draped in white linen, less an altar than a stage. Around it gathered physicians summoned by the crown clerics in black robes, whispering Latin prayers, and envoys from Spain who had come to certify what treaties alone could not guarantee. Their faces were unreadable, their eyes sharpened by expectation. Isabel, just 13, felt all of them watching her with a weight more unbearable than iron chains. In the logic of dynasties, her body was no longer private. It was a border to be inspected, a guarantee to be notarized. Virginity and intimate reality of flesh and blood was elevated into a political document. For centuries, courts across Europe had demanded proof that the women who would bear heirs were untouched, uncontested property of the dynasty. What should have been safeguarded as dignity became public currency. And now that long tradition of intrusion had arrived at Isabel's door. She was commanded to undress. Her fingers trembled on the clasps of her gown's silk, sliding from her shoulders onto the stone floor. The cold air rushed against her skin, harsher than any whip. She stood before them, men she did not know, men whose pens already scratched parchment stripped of the last remnants of girlhood. The damas who had accompanied her turned their eyes away, some weeping silently, others rigid in their obedience to court order. Isabel could not weep. Tears would have confirmed her weakness, and even in terror, she clung to a mute pride. The physicians moved forward with gestures precise and dispassionate. They did not see a child. They saw evidence to be recorded, a mechanism to be verified. Their hands touched, pressed, examined. They murmured to one another in the professional cadence of men conducting an experiment, not a violation. One dipped a quill recording the observations. The sound of ink scratching across parchment filled the silence like the groan of a prison gate closing. In Isabel's mind, time fractured. She did not fully grasp the ritual's meaning, but she understood enough to feel the burn of humiliation. She felt her face flush hot, though the rest of her body shivered. She thought of the dolls taken from her, of the gardens where she once ran of her sisters, who would still sleep in safety while she was being turned inside out by strangers. Above all, she understood the loneliness that no one would stop this. Not her father, not her mother, not the clerics murmuring prayers as if sanctifying her degradation. When it was over, a mantle was thrown around her shoulders. She was led back to her chambers in silence as though nothing had happened. Behind her, the men continued to write. Their conclusion would travel across borders faster than she could. The princess is intact, the treaty secure, the alliance sanctified. For them, the ritual was complete. For Isabel, something had been stolen that no parchment could restore. The French court accepted the report with relief. The Spanish envoys bowed in satisfaction. The church blessed the outcome as divine assurance. All spoke of peace, of God's will, of dynastic stability. Only Isabel's silence told the real story, the silence of a child whose innermost self had been transformed into evidence. That day marked the first of her symbolic deaths. She had not bled, not yet, but she had been cut all the same. What should have been her secret, her private unfolding into womanhood, had been torn open and displayed as proof. The room had taken her innocence and translated it into a certificate stamped by men who never once asked if she consented. The ordeal Isabel endured was not invented for her alone. It was the product of centuries of fear that thrones might be stolen by bastards, that dynasties might collapse if the purity of a queen were ever in doubt. In monarchies where power passed through blood, the womb of a princess was treated as a vault. To ensure its integrity, rulers demanded keys of verification. Thus was born the grotesque ritual of proving virginity, a ritual that converted private humanity into public evidence. Dynastic anxiety shaped the practice. Inheritance law across Europe was clear. Only legitimate heirs could claim the throne. But legitimacy rested not on the child's innocence, but on the mother's chastity at marriage. If the bride was untouched, the offspring could be presumed royal by right. If not, every crown risked collapse into suspicion, rebellion, even civil war. Monarchs had seen the danger. Rumours of infidelity had once toppled queens, delegitimized sons, and invited foreign claimants. To preempt such scandal, they created a cruel shortcut, an official inspection to certify a girl's purity before she ever entered a king's bed. Theology fortified the habit. The church sanctified virginity as not merely desirable, but sacred, a visible sign of divine order. In sermons, priests compared the undefiled maiden to the Virgin Mary herself, suggesting that political stability depended on the echo of that model. To question a princess's virginity was to question God's design for the dynasty, and so clerics stood in the rooms with physicians and envoys, their muttered prayers transmuting humiliation into sacrament. What was violence in truth became sanctity in appearance. Yet at the heart of it all was bureaucracy. Men in robes and armour could not feel Isabel's shame. They could only record it, and record they did in dry lines of ink examined, found intact, suitable for union. Those words scratched across parchment weighed more than her tears. They became instruments of policy passed between courts like bonds of credit. The bureaucrat's pen did not tremble. It merely transformed her pain into data, her body into a ledger entry. This was how humiliation became protocol. Once codified, it repeated itself endlessly unquestioned. Physicians viewed it as duty, diplomats as necessity, priests as ritual. Each man believed he was preserving the order of kingdoms, none admitted he was dismantling the dignity of a girl. Over time, the practice became invisible to conscience, as routine as coronations or oaths of allegiance. What had begun as paranoia hardened into tradition, defended precisely because it had been done before. Isabel was not the first to suffer such a theft, and she would not be the last. Her examination was one link in a long chain of women reduced to guarantees their worth, measured by membranes and reports. The peace of Cateau-Cambrésis, celebrated with banquets and bells, was in fact sealed with the invisible ink of her shame. The parchment survives in archives, her tears do not. Yet both were real, both were instruments of state. To call it an invention is no exaggeration. Virginity was remade as an artifact, something tangible, inspectable, provable, as though it were coin or parchment, and once invented it became currency. In Isabel's time, that currency was as binding as gold. To Spain, her intact body was the receipt of a treaty. To France, the proof of good faith. To the Church, the sign of God's blessing. Only to Isabel herself was it none of these things. To her, it was theft disguised as duty, silence disguised as honour. The day of Isabel's departure dawned bright as if the heavens themselves had been enlisted to sanctify the spectacle. Paris stirred with excitement, its streets filling with curious crowds eager to witness the great procession. To them it was not the exile of a child, but the triumph of France, a daughter sent to Spain as a pledge of peace. Trumpets blared, banners fluttered, and courtiers spoke in lofty tones. Honour, duty, gloire, stabilité. The city echoed with the vocabulary of a victory. At the heart of this pageantry sat Isabel, pale beneath the weight of her gilded carriage. The coaches gleamed with gold, pulled by horses draped in embroidered cloth, their hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones. Soldiers marched in perfect rhythm, a living wall of steel guarding the royal convoy. From windows and doorways, citizens cheered, waving scarves and caps as though they were celebrating the crowning of a monarch rather than the uprooting of a child. Inside the carriage, Isabel sat motionless. She was dressed in a gown heavier than her years, its stiff bodice digging into her ribs. Jewels glittered at her neck, but they felt cold like chains masquerading as finery. The voices of the crowd blurred into a dull roar. She pressed her small hands against her lap, trying to still their tremor. For the court, this was the theatre. For her, it was a funeral procession, though no one dared to call it so. Her mother, Catherine de' Medici, had wept in private but composed herself in public. She knew the script too well. She had once been the foreign bride paraded as proof of alliance. Now she watched her own daughter play the same role younger even than she had been. Catherine whispered a blessing under her breath, but her words were lost beneath the fanfare. Isabel caught only the trembling of her mother's lips, the sorrow in her eyes quickly masked by the steel of duty. Every symbol of the procession was calculated to erase Isabel's individuality. The banners bore the lilies of Valois, not her name. The songs praised the king's wisdom, not the daughter's sacrifice. Courtiers described her as a dove of peace, a bridge between empires, images that reduced her to metaphor. Her own voice was never part of the chorus. And yet in the small silence of her carriage, Isabel carried a private vocabulary. She did not think of honour or glory. She thought of her garden of the porcelain dolls already taken from her, of the laughter of her sisters echoing through the palace halls. Each cheer of the crowd was another spade of earth on the burial of her childhood. She wanted to cry, but the lessons drilled into her forbade it. A queen in training does not weep, they told her. So she swallowed her grief, and the silence within her grew heavy like stone. The cortege wound its way out of Paris past the gates that had once enclosed her childhood. Behind her, bells tolled in celebration. To her ears, they sounded like dirges. For France, it was the birth of a new alliance. For Isabel, it was the death of herself as daughter, sister, child. She was leaving not merely a palace, but an entire self erased by protocol embalmed in ceremony. Thus the procession rolled on, for the city a festival, for the court a triumph, for Isabel a funeral without a grave. The journey south stretched like a trial carved into the land. Isabel's procession moved through valleys and across plains where the air grew drier, the sky larger, and the earth more austere than the gardens of her Parisian childhood. What had begun as a river crossing became a pilgrimage of dislocation, each mile hammering deeper the knowledge that she was not going home. The road was lined with fortresses, stone teeth set into the hillsides, reminders that Spain was a realm guarded by discipline, not frivolity. Their banners flapped in the wind, their garrisons turned out to salute as the convoy passed. Isabel, peering through the slit of her carriage window, felt their gaze as weight. The soldiers did not look at her as men look at a child. They looked as though she were already a queen, an object to be obeyed, inspected, perhaps even feared. To a girl of 13, that scrutiny was more suffocating than any chain. Travel itself reshaped her body. The Spanish diet, heavier with olive oil and dark bread, replaced the lighter fare of France. Prayers multiplied morning, noon and night. The convoy paused for mass, the rhythm of religion beating more insistently than the clatter of hooves. Every stop was attended by clerics whose sermons reminded her of duty, purity, obedience. Each blessing pressed the lesson deeper. Her life was no longer her own. Surveillance became her new air. Even as she sat in her carriage, she was never unwatched. Spanish ladies in waiting, stiff in posture and speech, recorded her smallest gestures. Did she cross herself correctly? Did she bow her head with sufficient modesty? Every movement was a test she had not been told she was taking. Conversation became a minefield. She knew little of Castilian, and each misstep of pronunciation drew patient correction. Her silences, once filled with inward reflection, became part of her training. To be quiet was to be safe. At last, after weeks of roads that grew more parched and villages more sparse, Madrid appeared. Rising above the dusty plain, the Alcázar loomed a fortress palace planted on its hill like a sermon in stone. Its towers stood rigid, its walls severe, its windows narrow. Slits through which light entered grudgingly. Unlike the palaces of France designed for pleasure and spectacle, the Alcázar declared itself as a theology of control. It was a citadel of monarchy and faith, not a playground for children. Isabel felt its weight before she even crossed the threshold. The building seemed to absorb laughter, to demand silence, to enforce gravity by its very architecture. Where Parisian halls glowed with colour, this castle spoke in tones of grey and black, its crucifixes and relics whispering of sacrifice rather than delight. To enter it was to enter a world where spontaneity withered, where even walls seemed to lean in judging. For Isabel, the ride to Madrid was not merely a passage of geography. It was a recalibration of the senses, a stripping away of lightness, a training in austerity. By the time the Alcázar swallowed her, she was already being remade. Her body adapted to new food, her days to endless prayer, her spirit to the constant gaze of others. A different sky arched above her, now vast and merciless, and beneath it she felt smaller than ever. The Alcázar did not welcome, it subdued. Its walls thick and shadowed, dictated how one must move, think, even breathe. Isabel, barely 14, quickly learned that within these halls nothing escaped notice. The palace was less a home than a system designed to shape her into what to Spain required not a girl, not even a wife, but an emblem of obedience. Her days were carved into rituals. At dawn the bells summoned her to prayer, followed by mass attended under the watchful eyes of confessors who measured not only her words but her silences. Confession became a kind of daily audit. Every flicker of impatience, every trace of homesickness was scrutinized as though it were sin. She spoke little, for she understood that speech could condemn her. Better to let silence stand in place of thought. Meals were another lesson. At the French court, dining had been lively, accompanied by laughter, music, even play. Here meals unfolded in solemn quiet, punctuated only by blessings and the murmured courtesies of those who sat at her side. Each bite was observed, each slip of etiquette marked. She was told when to lift her spoon, when to fold her hands, when to bow her head. Even hunger no longer belonged to her. Her movements were trained into patterns of gravity. Tutors instructed her to walk with measured pace, to bow at precise angles, to keep her back straight, as though her spine itself were a pillar of the state. Mirrors reflected not a child, but a construct, a figure draped in black velvet, her expression carefully neutral, her posture rehearsed to perfection. She studied her reflection and searched for the girl she remembered, but she no longer found her. The Alcázar had drained the spontaneity from her body, replacing it with a rigidity that was praised as dignity. The court scrutiny was relentless. Nobles whispered judgments about her composure, ladies-in-waiting corrected the smallest deviations from protocol, confessors reminded her that every gesture should honour God and King. A misplaced laugh was condemned as frivolous, an unguarded glance labelled immodest. Each day tightened the invisible bars around her. Freedom was not lost in a single act, but in the accumulation of countless restrictions until she could not move without sensing the chain. In her solitude, Isabel sometimes tried to recall the gardens of Paris, the breeze that had once tangled her hair, the sound of her sisters' voices echoing through corridors full of colour, but memory itself felt dangerous. Nostalgia could be mistaken for ingratitude, and so she hid even her thoughts, folding them inward until they became secret prayers whispered into her pillow at night. The Alcázar taught her a cruel arithmetic that the less she revealed, the safer she was. The less she moved, the fewer mistakes she made. The less she spoke, the less she could be judged. Bit by bit, she disappeared into the role crafted for her. The cage was not iron, but etiquette, not locked doors, but the constant presence of eyes, and yet it was no less a prison. The journey south stretched like a trial carved into the land. Isabel's procession moved through valleys and across plains where the air grew drier, the sky larger, and the earth more austere than the gardens of her Parisian childhood. What had begun as a river crossing became a pilgrimage of dislocation, each mile hammering deeper, the knowledge that she was not going home. The road was lined with fortresses, stone teeth set into the hillsides, reminders that Spain was a realm guarded by discipline, not frivolity. Their banners flapped in the wind, their garrisons turned out to salute as the convoy passed. Isabel, peering through the slit of her carriage window, felt their gazes wait. The soldiers did not look at her as men look at a child. They looked as though she were already a queen, an object to be obeyed, inspected, perhaps even feared. To a girl of 13, that scrutiny was more suffocating than any chain. Travel itself reshaped her body. The Spanish diet, heavier with olive oil and dark bread, replaced the lighter fare of France. Prayers multiplied morning, noon and night. The convoy paused for mass, the rhythm of religion beating more insistently than the clatter of hooves. Every stop was attended by clerics whose sermons reminded her of duty, purity, obedience. Each blessing pressed the lesson deeper: her life was no longer her own. Surveillance became her new heir. Even as she sat in her carriage, she was never unwatched. Spanish ladies-in-waiting, stiff in posture and speech, recorded her smallest gestures. Did she cross herself correctly? Did she bow her head with sufficient modesty? Every movement was a test she had not been told she was taking. Conversation became a minefield. She knew little of Castilian, and each misstep of pronunciation drew patient correction. Her silences, once filled with inward reflection, became part of her training. To be quiet was to be safe. At last, after weeks of roads that grew more parched and villages more sparse, Madrid appeared. Rising above the dusty plain, the Alcazar loomed a fortress palace planted on its hill, like a sermon in stone. Its towers stood rigid, its walls severe, its windows narrow slits through which light entered grudgingly. Unlike the palaces of France designed for pleasure and spectacle, the Alcazar declared itself as a theology of control. It was a citadel of monarchy and faith, not a playground for children. Isabel felt its weight before she even crossed the threshold. The building seemed to absorb laughter, to demand silence, to enforce gravity by its very architecture. Where Parisian halls glowed with colour, this castle spoke in tones of grey and black, its crucifixes and relics whispering of sacrifice rather than delight. To enter it was to enter a world where spontaneity withered, where even walls seemed to lean in judging. For Isabel, the ride to Madrid was not merely a passage of geography. It was a recalibration of the senses, a stripping away of lightness, a training in austerity. By the time the Alcazar swallowed her, she was already being remade. Her body adapted to new food, her days to endless prayer, her spirit to the constant gaze of others. A different sky arched above her, now vast and merciless, and beneath it she felt smaller than ever. The Alcazar did not welcome. It subdued. Its walls, thick and shadowed, dictated how one must move, think, even breathe. Isabel, barely 14, quickly learned that within these halls nothing escaped notice. The palace was less a home than a system designed to shape her into what Spain required, not a girl, not even a wife, but an emblem of obedience. Her days were carved into rituals. At dawn the bells summoned her to prayer, followed by mass attended under the watchful eyes of confessors who measured not only her words but her silences. Confession became a kind of daily audit. Every flicker of impatience, every trace of homesickness was scrutinized as though it were sin. She spoke little, for she understood that speech could condemn her. Better to let silence stand in place of thought. Meals were another lesson. At the French court, dining had been lively, accompanied by laughter, music, even play. Here meals unfolded in solemn quiet, punctuated only by blessings, and the murmured courtesies of those who sat at her side. Each bite was observed, each slip of etiquette marked. She was told when to lift her spoon, when to fold her hands, when to bow her head. Even hunger no longer belonged to her. Her movements were trained into patterns of gravity. Tutors instructed her to walk with measured pace, to bow at precise angles to keep her back straight, as though her spine itself were a pillar of the state. Mirrors reflected not a child, but a construct, a figure draped in black velvet. Her expression carefully neutral, her posture rehearsed to perfection. She studied her reflection and searched for the girl she remembered, but she no longer found her. The Alcazar had drained the spontaneity from her body, replacing it with a rigidity that was praised as dignity. The court's scrutiny was relentless. Nobles whispered judgments about her. Composure ladies-in-waiting corrected the smallest deviations from protocol. Confessors reminded her that every gesture should honour God and King. A misplaced laugh was condemned as frivolous, an unguarded glance labelled immodest. Each day tightened the invisible bars around her. Freedom was not lost in a single act, but in the accumulation of countless restrictions until she could not move without sensing the chain. In her solitude, Isabel sometimes tried to recall the gardens of Paris, the breeze that had once tangled her hair, the sound of her sisters' voices echoing through corridors full of colour. But memory itself felt dangerous. Nostalgia could be mistaken for ingratitude, and so she hid even her thoughts, folding them inward until they became secret prayers whispered into her pillow at night. The Alcazar taught her a cruel arithmetic that the less she revealed, the safer she was. The less she moved, the fewer mistakes she made. The less she spoke, the less she could be judged. Bit by bit, she disappeared into the role crafted for her. The cage was not iron but etiquette, not locked doors but the constant presence of eyes. And yet it was no less a prison. The bells of Madrid rang with thunderous joy on Isabel's wedding day. Streets swelled with processions, balconies, draped in crimson and gold, crowds pressing forward to glimpse the child who would now be their queen. The court proclaimed the union as a divine triumph. France and Spain reconciled dynasties bound Christendom made stronger. Priests intoned solemn blessing, nobles displayed their finery, and the air itself seemed perfumed with incense and expectation. But at the heart of this splendour walked a girl who trembled beneath the weight of her gown. Isabel, only 14, was robed in a dress so heavy with gold and silver thread that each step became an ordeal. The veil pressed against her face like a curtain between her and the world. She could hear the roar of celebration outside, yet inside her chest there was only dread. What they called joy she felt as judgment. What they called glory she felt as loss.
Sir.
At the altar waiting stood Philip V of Spain. 32 years old, his figure was tall but gaunt, his expression set in the unyielding lines of severity. His reputation had travelled to Isabel long before she ever saw him in flesh, a king of iron devotion who lived more for duty than for affection, more for governance and prayer than for companionship. Chroniclers whispered of his coldness, his rigid piety, his obsessions with ceremony and order. To the world he was the embodiment of monarchical authority. To a young girl forced into his orbit, he was a shadow distant, inscrutable and terrifying. The ceremony unfolded with a precision that smothered all spontaneity. Priests blessed the union as though consecrating an empire, not a marriage. Courtiers observed every gesture, recording with their eyes whether the vows were spoken clearly, whether the hands joined firmly, whether the kiss sealed obligation. For Isabel the words were hollow sounds she barely comprehended. She was not binding her life to a man, she was sealing a contract between nations. She dared a glance at Philip's face as he uttered the vows. His eyes did not meet hers with tenderness, but with the gravity of someone fulfilling an assignment. There was no warmth, no hint of recognition that the trembling figure beside him was a child torn from her world. His gaze seemed already elsewhere, on the machinery of governance, on the demands of empire, on the stern god who sanctioned his authority. Isabel felt as though she were marrying not a person but a principle. When the vows ended and the cathedral erupted in applause, Isabel did not smile. She bowed her head as taught, letting the weight of her crown disguise the tears that threatened. Around her courtiers rejoiced at the spectacle of union, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to admit that the bride had become more emblem than human. Thus the wedding of Isabel de Valois and Philip II was celebrated across Europe as the triumph of diplomacy, the victory of peace. Yet beneath the echo of bells and the glitter of ceremony, a truth lingered. This was not the meeting of souls, but the binding of crowns. For Isabel, the wedding day was not the beginning of companionship, but at the confirmation of captivity. She had been joined to a shadow, and in that shadow her own light began to dim. The night of Isabel's wedding did not belong to her. It belonged to the court, to the treaty, to the empire that had demanded her body as its guarantee. Behind the closed doors of the bridal chamber there was no intimacy, no whisper of tenderness. The girl of 14, scarcely able to carry the weight of her gown, was expected to carry the weight of Europe instead. Philip approached her with the solemnity of a man performing duty rather than offering comfort. For him, consummation was not the beginning of a shared life, but the completion of a political contract. He moved with cold precision, his gestures mechanical, his eyes heavy with piety and governance rather than desire. Isabel, frightened and uncomprehending, endured in silence, for silence had become her only shield. Yet what was most brutal about that night was not the act itself, but what followed. In the morning, the bed linen was carried from the chamber and displayed a sheet transformed into evidence. Courtiers gathered to see, envoys nodded in satisfaction. Priests murmured prayers of thanksgiving. The small stain of blood upon cloth was greeted as proof more binding than any oath or seal. For the kingdoms it was triumph, for Isabel it was exposure. Her pain, her fear, the confusion of her first night as a wife, none of these mattered. All that mattered was the visible token of virginity consumed, of union accomplished. Her privacy was stripped from her, as surely as her childhood had been her innermost self paraded before strangers in the language of politics. She had become a parchment signed in flesh, her body turned into a ledger that recorded not love, but obligation. This cruel custom was not Spain's alone. Across Europe, noble brides had endured the same indignity, a ritual that transformed suffering into celebration, humiliation into protocol. What should have been hidden within the sacredness of intimacy was dragged into the light as spectacle. The sheet became more important than the girl, the blood more valuable than her voice. And so the marriage of Isabel de Valois and Philip II was declared valid not by words spoken at the altar, but by the linen raised at dawn. In that moment the state reinscribed itself into her body, proclaiming her pain as proof of stability. What others hailed as reassurance, Isabel felt as erasure. The world saw a queen, she felt only the wound of a child made public. From the morning after her wedding, Isabel's marriage revealed itself as a performance rather than a partnership. Philip II appeared at her side often enough to silence gossip, yet his presence carried no intimacy. In public, he offered her his arm with ceremonial gravity, escorted her through cathedrals and council halls, bowed his head in measured courtesy. But his eyes rarely lingered on hers, and his hand never sought hers except when etiquette demanded it. Politeness was maintained, warmth was withheld. Their life together became choreography. At processions, Isabel learned the rhythm of his stride and adjusted her steps so as not to falter. At banquets, she sat at his right hand, smiling softly when spoken to, silent when not. The court praised her composure, remarking on her modesty and restraint. They did not see the discipline it required for a 14-year-old to time her breath with the swell of chance, to hold her smile steady, even as loneliness hollowed her chest. Philip's governance consumed him. His days were measured out in councils, petitions, audiences with confessors, endless documents requiring his signature. He carried himself as a man wedded to empire, with little space left for the bride at his side. When he did speak to Isabel, his words were courteous but formal, an instruction, a pious reminder, a fragment of protocol. She answered with quiet obedience, for she had already learned that silence pleased him more than questions. In this theatre of monarchy, Isabel herself became an instrument of spectacle. Her gowns, heavy with black velvet and stiff embroidery, proclaimed Spain's gravity more loudly than her voice ever could. The jewels she wore were not adornments, but signals, glinting reminders of dynastic union. Her task was to embody presence without speaking, to symbolize harmony without feeling it. Even her gestures, how deeply she curtsied, how slowly she raised her eyes, were watched and judged as though they were clauses in the treaty itself. Privately, Isabel longed for something more than rehearsed civility, but she quickly understood that longing was dangerous. A misplaced glance could be read as rebellion, an unguarded laugh as frivolity, and so she pressed her desires down, burying them beneath the skin, until obedience felt like her only safe language. What had begun as training in the French court became survival in Spain, the art of vanishing into the role others had written. Thus her marriage unfolded, two figures moving side by side in perfect symmetry, yet never touching in truth. To the watching court they appeared united. To Isabel, each procession, each ceremony, was another rehearsal in the theatre of distance. She had married a man who treated her like an emblem, and so she learned to live as one. From the moment Isabel crossed the threshold of the Alcázar, as Philip's wife, her body was no longer her own. It became a calendar watched by many eyes, a ledger in which each month was measured, not by festivals or seasons, but by the presence or absence of blood. Courtiers noted discreetly when she tired too quickly, when her complexion grew pale, when her appetite shifted. Maids were instructed to record her smallest ailments, and confessors reminded her that every pang of her body might signal either God's blessing or his displeasure. Pregnancy was not joy, it was an audit. If Isabel's belly began to swell, the court whispered of hope. If it did not, the same lips whispered of failure. Midwives, physicians, and priests all participated in the ritual of observation. One offered remedies of herbs, another insisted on stricter devotion, another demanded confession for sins that might impede fertility. Each claimed authority over her womb, yet none acknowledged her fear. When the first pregnancy ended in loss, the corridors of the Alcázar absorbed the news in silence. Officially, the tragedy was hidden, but everyone knew. The whispers changed tone. Some muttered that her youth was the problem, others that God had closed her womb, others still that France's blood was weak. No one asked about her tears. To the court, her miscarriage was not the death of a child, but the disruption of a succession plan. Prayers multiplied. Special masses were offered. Relics were brought into her chamber. Philip himself ordered vigils. But even these rituals carried the cold weight of calculation. They were not acts of compassion, but investments in stability. If the prayers worked, the dynasty would be secured. If not, suspicion would turn toward Isabel herself. Every subsequent pregnancy followed the same patterns: excitement at the first signs, hushed rumours at the first complications, quiet resignation when another loss occurred. Each time Isabel's grief was absorbed into the machinery of politics. Her pain was translated into failure statistics whispered about in corners of the palace, where noblemen tallied the chances of an heir as if they were calculating revenues. The pressure grew heavier. With every month she remained childless, with every loss that shadowed her name. Isabel began to feel herself less as a person, and more as a vessel judged defective. Her own body betrayed her, and the court confirmed it with their silence. She was a queen, yet treated like a broken instrument, useful only insofar as she might deliver a son worthless if she did not. In that oppressive arithmetic, Isabel's humanity was erased. The girl who once ran through gardens and laughed in sunlight was reduced to whispers and numbers. Her womb had become the only measure of her value, and in the eyes of Spain every month she failed to produce an heir was another entry of disappointment inked against her name. Within the Alcazar, Isabel's body was never hers. It belonged to an uneasy trinity of authorities who claimed equal right to govern it: confessors, physicians, and midwives. Each approached her with a different vocabulary, yet all served the same end, turning her fertility into the axis upon which Spain's future revolved. The confessors cloaked their scrutiny in holiness. They spoke to Isabel of duty, of purity, of the sacred mission to bring forth heirs for God's chosen king. If her body faltered, they urged her to search her soul for hidden sins. Was her heart too restless with memories of France? Did she harbour resentment, however silent, toward her husband? Even a flicker of impatience was interpreted as a barrier to divine favour. Her womb became a pulpit where sermons of obedience were silently preached. Physicians, meanwhile, approached her as though she were a specimen. They studied her complexion, pulse, and appetite with the same detachment they might have given to the study of weather. They prescribed tonics of herbs, baths, and cold water, and diets designed to balance humours. Each miscarriage was analysed in clinical language: too much heat in the blood, insufficient rest, improper tempering of the womb. Their records treated her grief not as human loss, but as medical data, an entry in a ledger where the patient's tears were irrelevant. The midwives, women who had seen countless births and deaths, brought with them a different authority, earthly, intimate, but no less heavy. They laid their hands on Isabel's belly, murmured prayers, offered charms. Yet even their care came laden with expectation. They too whispered of omens, a dream left untold, a craving resisted, a sigh suppressed. For every failure, an explanation had to be found, and it always circled back to Isabel herself. Together, these three forces constructed a theology of expectation. Success meant divine blessing, failure meant fault. A stillbirth was not only tragedy, but also warning. A miscarriage was not only pain, but also possible punishment. The line between medical report and moral verdict blurred, until Isabel could no longer separate her body from her soul in their eyes. Each loss weighed not only on her heart, but on her conscience. She began to wonder whether God himself had judged her unworthy. Philip, absorbed in governance, echoed this theology by his silence. He did not comfort her after a loss. He prayed, fasted, and commissioned more masses. To him, grief was not a private matter, but a national crisis to be corrected with more devotion. Isabel, meanwhile, retreated deeper into herself. Her prayers grew longer, more desperate, less like communion with God, and more like bargaining with an unyielding master. Thus the young queen lived inside a web where medicine, morality, and ritual braided themselves into a single rope of pressure. Her womb was monitored, as though it were a fortress under siege, its openings and closings read as signs of divine favour or divine wrath. And in this cruel arithmetic of faith and flesh, Isabel's humanity vanished. She was no longer daughter, wife, or girl. She was only expectancy itself, her worth measured in prayers, in prescriptions, in whispers that all was ended by blaming her. In the suffocating order of the Alcazar, Isabel discovered that the body remembers what the mind tries to bury. Every miscarriage left behind a shadow, a dull ache that returned in moments of stillness. She would sit in her chamber upright as etiquette demanded, hands folded on her lap, while inside her chest grief pressed like an unhealed bruise. The court praised her composure, calling it maturity. They did not see that her silence was the language of sorrow. Protocol gave her no space to weep. Tears would have been read as weakness or worse, rebellion. So Isabel retreated into the few corners of life that still allowed her to breathe. She found solace in Maddock plucking timid notes on the lute when attendants pretended not to listen. letting the vibration in her fingertips echo emotions she could not speak. At times she hummed fragments of French songs remembered from childhood, soft enough to escape notice, soft enough to feel like contraband. Among her ladies-in-waiting there were flickers of compassion. A hand lingered a second longer when, adjusting her gown, a whispered word of comfort passed between prayers. These small kindnesses were fragile like threads woven in secret, but to Isabel they were lifelines. They reminded her that somewhere beneath the rigid structure of court humanity still survived. At night, when the corridors grew quiet, Isabel sometimes reached for parchment. She drafted letters she never sent to her mother, to her sisters, even to the girl she herself had once been. She wrote of the gardens she missed, of the fear she carried, of the emptiness that settled deeper with each loss. She folded the letters carefully and hid them away, as if secrecy could protect her truths. The act of writing became her rebellion, not against the king, not against Spain, but against the erasure of herself. Her body, though young, carried memories the court would not acknowledge. It remembered the trembling of that first examination in Paris, the cold weight of the Spanish gown at the Bidassoa, the shiver of humiliation after the bridal chamber, the spasms of miscarriages endured in silence. These memories lived not in words, but in muscle and marrow. When she bowed her back, stiffened with more than etiquette, it stiffened with the weight of all she'd carried, and yet by daylight she became surface. She lowered her eyes at the proper moments, smiled when required, responded with the precise degree of humility. The courtiers saw a queen shaped to perfection. They did not see that inside her chest a different Isabel still whispered. A child displaced a girl whose body remembered everything it had been forced to forget. France for Isabel did not vanish in a single moment. It ebbed away piece by piece until she could no longer tell when memory ended and Spain began. The first erosion was language. At meals at Mass, in the daily rhythm of Court Castilian, dominated every exchange. Her attempts to answer in French were met with polite incomprehension or quiet correction until the syllables of her childhood began to sound foreign even to her own tongue. Letters from Paris were rare, filtered through secretaries, and even when she read them, the words carried the echo of a world slipping out of reach. Her mother's voice, once firm in her ear, became a paper ghost. The second erosion was clothing. Gone were the bright silks and playful ornaments of the Valois court. Spanish gowns enclosed her like armour, black velvets stiff with embroidery collars that rose like barriers. Sleeves so heavy they strained her shoulders. Each layer carried meaning, modesty, gravity, obedience. What France had once celebrated as charm or vivacity was here suppressed as frivolity. Even her hair were bound more tightly coiled into arrangements that emphasized discipline over grace. A body draped in France's colours could laugh. A body imprisoned in Castile's austerity could only bow. Gradually Isabel felt her own reflection shift. Mirrors no longer returned the face of a French princess. They showed the outline of a Spanish queen sculpted by custom and necessity. Her smile grew rarer. Her eyes learned to stay lowered. She began to sense the Alcazar itself as a sculptor. Its narrow windows taught her to prefer dimness. Its corridors echoing with measured footsteps trained her to walk without haste. Its chapels thick with incense imprinted piety on her breath. Place itself was moulding her, engineering a new personality out of silence and weight. The Spaniards called this gravedad gravity. It was more than solemnity. It was an aesthetic, a discipline, a code of being that demanded restraint in every gesture. Isabel learned to embody it. The lively girl who once giggled in Parisian gardens became a figure of composed silence, her laughter buried beneath protocol. To survive, she had to internalize the hardness around her, and so France faded not violently but like a dream dissolving with morning light. Castile replaced it with an identity more severe, one that demanded she bury the girl she had been, in losing her language, her clothing, her habits. Isabel lost also the memory of what it felt like to belong. She became Spanish not by choice but by erasure, and in that erasure she understood the cruel genius of empire. It does not merely conquer land, it remakes the people who cross its thresholds until even their reflections forget where they came from. In the long shadow of loss, Isabel did know moments of light. Against the bleak arithmetic of miscarriages and stillbirths, there were children who survived daughters. Their arrival should have been joy enough for any mother. Yet in the dynastic logic of 16th century Spain, daughters were not counted as triumphs but as delays. The kingdom needed a son to secure succession. Girls were deemed fragile threads in a line that demanded iron. When Isabel first held her newborn, her hands trembling with both exhaustion and awe, the world outside her chamber did not pause. Courtiers whispered calculations, alliances that could be forged through marriage, the political worth of a girl who might one day become another pawn. Yet in that fragile instant before the midwives took the infant to be swaddled in courtly expectation, Isabel allowed herself a private tenderness. She pressed her lips to the soft crown of hair, inhaled the scent of new life, and felt for a heartbeat that she was simply a mother. But even this joy was muffled by ceremony. Baptism was staged with splendor priests intoning blessings, as if to remind Isabel that the child belonged not to her, but to God and dynasty. The baby's cradle was placed beneath crucifixes and heraldic symbols, as though lineage were as important as milk. Nurses took over much of the care, reporting to the court as though the infant were already an official matter. Isabel's role was carefully circumscribed. She was to appear at designated times to embody maternal dignity, while others managed the practical tasks of feeding and watching. Yet Isabel sought cracks in this structure where tenderness could live. In the quiet of her chambers, she sometimes dismissed attendants to rock her daughter herself, humming fragments of French lullabies that survived only in her memory. She whispered words her child could not understand, speaking them as much to soothe herself as to soothe the infant. In these hidden moments, the queen dissolved, and only the young woman remained a mother, clinging to a humanity the court worked daily to erase. Still the pressure did not relent. Each daughter born was followed by renewed prayers for a son. Each smile at a christening was tempered by the murmured refrain, "Not enough." When her girls laughed, when their tiny hands grasped her finger, Isabel felt joy piercing the gloom, but always in the back of her mind loomed the knowledge that the court saw them as temporary victories at best. Her love was unconditional. The dynasty's love was conditional and conditioned upon the hope that she might finally deliver a boy. Thus, amid the darkness of expectation, Isabel experienced fleeting light. Her daughters were living proof that she could bring forth life even if the court measured them as disappointments. They were her secret triumphs, even when the empire treated them as placeholders. In their small faces she found her only mirror of tenderness, the only part of her world not scripted by protocol. But even this bond was shadowed, for Isabel knew that each giggle, each fragile breath was not enough to silence the whispers that circled her womb. The Alcazar was a palace of echoes, but not all sounds carried equally. Prayers reverberated endlessly, chants rising from chapels whispered, rosaries in corridors, the measured cadence of monks pacing stone floors. But laughter did not travel. It seemed to die upon the walls swallowed by the fortress, as if joy itself were out of place. Isabel noticed this absence more keenly with each passing year. Even her daughters' giggles felt subdued, their play muffled by the weight of expectation pressing down from every corner of the court. Expectation there lay the true acoustics of the Alcazar. Every corridor hummed with gossip, every chamber vibrated with verdicts. Courtiers counted not Isabel's smiles or her kindness, but her pregnancies, her cycles, her failures. They tallied miscarriages like losses on a battlefield, and every successful birth was followed by the same refrain, but still no son. Isabel began to feel herself not as a queen, but as a column of figures in an invisible ledger. To Spain she was not flesh, not spirit, not youth, but an equation that refused to balance. The arithmetic was relentless. Each year without a male heir subtracted from her worth. Each rumour of another pregnancy briefly added hope, only to be erased when illness or miscarriage claimed the child. Around her the court moved like accountants of destiny, weighing her womb against the future of empire. Physicians cloaked it in the language of medicine, priests in the language of providence, but the result was the same. Isabel lived as a calculation, her humanity reduced to numbers, whispered behind fans and within confessionals. This constant weighing eroded her body as surely as illness. She grew thinner, her complexion paler, her movements slower. Hope itself became an obligation, one she carried, until her bones seemed to bend beneath it. Even joy was measured against expectation. A smile at her daughter's play might be praised as maternal virtue, but it could never outweigh the absence of a son. At night, when the palace fell silent, Isabel sometimes lay awake, listening to the sounds that did carry. The toll of bells at midnight mass, the heavy footsteps of guards changing posts, the faint creak of the wind against shutters. All solemn, all reminders of vigilance, yet never the unrestrained laughter she remembered from Paris when halls rang with music and voices unafraid of being overheard. The Alcazar's silence was not emptiness, it was control. In such a place even sighs felt dangerous. To release a breath too heavily to allow weariness to show was to invite comment, speculation, judgment. Isabel learned to breathe carefully to let her chest rise and fall in rhythm with the expectations around her. Her sighs became internal, folded deep into her ribs, invisible to the eyes that never stopped watching. Thus she lived in a court that could not sigh, could not laugh, could not permit a queen to be human. And in the slow erasure of sound, Isabel herself began to fade, her voice absorbed into the same silence that had consumed her childhood. The winter of 1568 pressed heavily on Madrid, and with it came Isabel's final trial. At 21, her body was already worn from the cycle of hope and loss of pregnancies that ended in mourning and the constant demand for more. Now she laboured again, her frame thin, her skin sallow, her strength frayed by years of scrutiny. What should have been the moment of a young woman's bloom was instead her last exhaustion. The chamber filled with the ritual cast of witnesses, physicians with quills poised to record midwives with towels folded, confessors murmuring prayers that braided together faith and fear. The crucifix above the bed seemed to bend closer, its shadow stretching long across the sheets. Isabel's breath came shallow, each contraction wringing not only her body, but her very will. She whispered fragments of prayer, but her voice was too weak to carry. Around her, the murmur of Latin continued more for the ears of heaven and history than for the girl struggling beneath the covers. The delivery was harsh, accompanied by fever that burned through her. Attendants brought cloths soaked in vinegar to her forehead, but the heat only rose. Outside the chamber, courtiers waited for news as though awaiting a verdict. Would it be a boy the longed-for heir or another disappointment? In the cruel logic of dynasty, Isabel's life mattered only as prelude to the infant's cry. When the child was placed in swaddling, there was no jubilation. The outcome did not match the desperate prayers of the court. Isabel, barely conscious, turned her head weakly towards the sound, but her body had already spent what little it had left. Fever coursed through her veins like fire. She whispered only 2 words faint as a breath. Estoy cansada. I am tired. The physicians exchanged glances, their hands steady, even as the truth pressed upon them. They continued to write, recording pulse temperature symptoms, as though accuracy could mask helplessness. The confessors leaned closer, offering absolution. One pressed a crucifix to her lips, urging her to think of salvation rather than the agony at hand. The midwives wiped her brow, whispering comforts too soft to reach her fading consciousness. And then, quietly, Isabel slipped away. Not with a scream, not with a proclamation, but with a surrender, her young body finally free of demands it had never been able to meet. The room stilled. The murmurs ceased. For a moment, only the crackle of a candle's flame broke the silence. Outside the court would soon learn the news the Queen was gone dead in childbirth at 21. Her life was measured and found wanting, not because she had failed in humanity, but because she had failed in the arithmetic of heirs. For the empire she left behind an incomplete ledger. For herself, she left behind only the memory of having been used up by a role she never chose. Her last labour was not only the birth of a child, it was the final proof that Isabel de Valois had been consumed by the expectations of 2 kingdoms, and that her life, brief and shadowed, had been valued less for its own light than for what it was expected to deliver. The morning of Isabel de Valois unfolded with the same choreography that had governed her life. Bells tolled across Madrid, their peals measured deliberate, summoning the city to solemnity. Black draperies veiled the streets, torches lined the processions, courtiers donned mourning garb heavy with symbolism. The funeral rites were splendid, almost theatrical, a display designed to reassure the kingdom that even in loss the crown remained unshaken. The Queen's coffin was borne through the capital, in a cortege of horses and halberds as priests chanting psalms as the crowd bowed in reverence. Chroniclers described the scene with reverent detail, the velvet pall, the embroidered standards of Castile and Aragon, the candles burning high into the winter air. Spain buried its queen, as if she were both saint and state, her body carried like a relic through the streets. Yet behind the pageantry there was no intimate grief acknowledged. Philip II, ever the king, observed protocol flawlessly. He bowed his head, ordered masses, commissioned chapels in her memory. But his governance did not falter. Within days he returned to council chambers, discussing alliances, signing decrees, calculating the next marital strategy for his dynasty. To him, Isabel had been a dutiful chapter closed now, with solemnity replaced by the next entry in the royal ledger. The difference between empire and intimacy was stark. To Spain, Isabel was already an inscription in genealogy, wife of Philip, daughter of Henri II, mother of daughters dead at 21, a name, a set of dates, a function. To her mother in France, to the sisters who had once played with her in gardens, the loss was flesh. Catherine de' Medici, when the news reached her, reportedly wept in solitude, mourning not a queen, but a child torn from her too soon. In Paris, her sisters remembered not velvet and crowns, but laughter and songs now silenced forever. The empire's sorrow was official, codified, administrative. It produced monuments, ledgers, and rituals designed to absorb grief into continuity. The family's sorrow was private, unmeasured, irreparable. One mourned a broken succession plan, the other mourned a daughter, a sister, a girl whose life had been carved away piece by piece. Thus Isabel passed from life into memory, her funeral as carefully staged as her marriage, her identity once more consumed by ceremony. Spain ensured that her death, like her life, served the stability of the crown. But no funeral splendour could mask the truth that behind the black banners and solemn chants lay a story of a young woman sacrificed to politics, remembered less for who she was than for what she was made to symbolise. Isabel de Valois' story did not end with her burial. It lingered in the silences of archives, in the terse genealogies that listed her as wife, mother, queen, dead at 21. History remembered her not for her laughter, her letters, or her grief, but for the function she fulfilled and failed. She became a line of succession, a clause in a treaty, a name attached to dynastic daughters. Her silence forced in life was extended into death. And yet that silence itself speaks. It reveals the politics of flesh, the way empires wrote treaties not only on parchment but on bodies. Isabel was transformed into a page upon which kings and councils inscribed their bargains. Her virginity certified peace. Her womb carried dynastic hopes. Her blood, her losses, her exhaustion were interpreted as the handwriting of God upon the body of a queen. She was evidence receipt ledger everything but herself. This was not unique to Spain or France. Across Europe, dynasties repeated the same logic: intimacy, weaponized fertility, audited women reduced to vessels of state. What Isabel endured was part of a system that normalized humiliation as ritual suffering, as protocol silence, as duty. To recall her story is to expose the machinery that rendered her invisible while consuming her completely. The echoes reach beyond her century. Even today, the language of proof lingers in subtler forms, the obsession with verifying, certifying, surveilling the private lives of women, the way institutions transform bodies into statistics, the quiet expectation that worth must be demonstrated through conformity to someone else's script. The faces have changed, but the logic is familiar. That is why naming the mechanism matters. To say aloud what was done to Isabel is to strip ceremony of its disguise and reveal its cruelty. It is to remind ourselves that what was called peace was paid for with a child's life, that what was described as glory was in fact erasure. Remembering restores a fragment of her dignity long denied. In the end, Isabel de Valois is more than a footnote in dynastic history. She is a mirror held up to power, a reminder that treaties, alliances, and empires often stand upon the silent suffering of the most vulnerable. To recall her not only as a queen, but as a girl, silenced and transformed into instrument, is to reclaim her humanity. For though history tried to reduce her to function, her silence, once spoken aloud, becomes testimony. And testimony is the first step toward justice, even across the centuries. History often dresses its cruelties in silks and banners. The tale of Isabel de Valois, offered at 13 to seal a treaty, inspected as evidence paraded in marriage, and consumed by the dynastic hunger for heirs, reminds us that what is celebrated in chronicles as peace or glory often conceals private suffering. Behind the bells of Cateau Cambrésis, behind the gilded carriages and solemn masses, was a child who lost her voice to the machinery of empire. Her life teaches us that silence itself can become the loudest testimony if we choose to listen. One lesson lies in the politics of flesh. Isabel's story shows how easily human beings can be reduced to instruments when institutions prize stability over compassion. For her, the body was never private. It was a treaty, a receipt, a ledger. And while our own age does not parade bridal linens, before courts echoes of that logic persist wherever individuals are valued only for productivity, appearance, or conformity. When we allow systems to measure worth by external proof rather than intrinsic humanity, we repeat the same cruelty in quieter forms. Another lesson is about the danger of normalized rituals. In Isabel's world, examinations of virginity and displays of blood were not seen as violence, but as routine protocol. Everyone, priests, physicians, courtiers, believed they were fulfilling duty. Cruelty disguised as necessity becomes invisible. This is a warning to us. Whenever we accept indignities simply because it has always been done this way, we risk perpetuating injustice. Questioning tradition is not irreverence. It is often the first act of compassion. Her life also illustrates the resilience of memory. Official records reduced Isabel to a role, but her silences, once recognised, speak volumes. They remind us that beneath every treaty, every institution, there are individuals whose stories deserve to be told. Restoring their voices restores balance to history. And in our own lives, remembering those overlooked, whether in workplaces, families, or communities, helps prevent the erasure of human dignity. Finally, Isabel's fate underscores the importance of choice. She never chose her marriage, her rituals, or even her language. Stripped of agency, she became the property of two crowns. Today we may not face dynastic politics, but the principle remains. Lives shrink when choices are denied, and they expand when voices are honoured. To create peace that lasts, we must build it on consent, not coercion, on dignity, not spectacle. In the end, Isabel de Valois embodies both tragedy and testimony. She was a child turned into a contract, yet her story calls us to vigilance. It urges us to examine how power still shapes bodies and silences voices, and to resist the temptation to accept cruelty hidden behind ritual or tradition. If we can learn to hear her silence as speech, then her short life leaves us with more than sorrow. It leaves us with a compass to honour humanity above protocol, compassion above convenience, and choice above control. Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.